Hi, you are in the ladies' room with Dr. Donica, the only public ladies' room you can enter anytime without ever waiting online. I'm your host, Dr. Donica Moore. We'll be having real conversations with real women about really intimate issues. They may be embarrassing, sad, or funny, but they will always be interesting and informative. You know, like the best conversations you've had in ladies' rooms with your best friends, or total strangers and a physician. Please join us. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. I am so excited for my next guest. I learned about her in mid-April. There was a Forbes magazine article, and the headline was, "A 32-year-old startup inspired by a health scare sells for $275 million. So yeah, that got my attention. It turns out that Surbhi Sarna was 13 and working on her homework in her bedroom when she felt a severe pain in her side. In fact, it was so severe, she blacked out. It turned out it was a complex ovarian cyst, doctors told her. Of course, they couldn't tell her until after it was taken care of that it wasn't cancer. So being at an impressionable age, this experience stayed with her and led her on a quest to be able to detect early ovarian cancer for other women. Now, while the device she then created is not yet marketed, Boston Scientific is buying the company, which is called nVision, for $150 million upfront and another $125 million to be paid as certain clinical and commercial milestones are hit over the next 4 years. Today, we're going to hear all about that from Surbhi Sarna, who was on Forbes 30 under 30 in healthcare list in 2014 and plans to remain with the company. Now, first, let me tell you a little bit about ovarian cysts. And I know a lot of women who are listening have had them, including me. And I will tell you my story. And of course, Surbhi will share her story. But ovarian cysts are very common in women, even who have regular periods. In fact, most women make at least one follicle or corpus luteum cyst every month. But you're not generally aware that you have a cyst unless there's a problem that either causes the cyst to grow or that causes multiple cysts to form. This situation is so common that I couldn't even find an accurate number or estimate of the number of women who have ovarian cysts per year. We know, of course, that they're much less common after menopause, and we also know that about 5 to 10% of women need surgery to remove an ovarian cyst. 13 to 21% of those cysts turned out to be cancer. Now, you may need the cyst removed if it's growing too large, too rapidly, is painful, or causing some other kind of problem. Now, I know that every woman who's listening has a story about how their ovarian cyst was discovered and how it impacted them. And I do want to hear those stories. So please tweet them at me or send them on Facebook or on Instagram with the hashtag AskDrDonica. But let me tell you my story. My story began 10 days after 9/11. I was at the Oxygen Network doing an interview on a show called Pure Oxygen. And for some reason, this was a standing interview. And being from Brooklyn, New York, I talk with my hands. I'm generally right-handed. So I was standing there with my left hand on my hip. And I was much thinner in those days. And while I was talking, ironically, about how my big concern 10 days after 9/11 was that there were going to be lots of people ignoring their routine medical problems or aches and pains that were abnormal or unusual because they were going to think, oh, this is nothing compared to what happened on 9/11. And as I was saying that with my left hand on my hip, I felt a mass. Now, of course, my first reaction was I was just imagining this. My second reaction was that I was crazy. And I continued to do the interview, went out to lunch with a friend of mine who happened to be a nurse. And I was telling her this, bizarre story of how I felt a mass while I was doing this interview. And she didn't think it was funny. In fact, being a good friend, she said, "What's your gynecologist's number?" and called her right then and there. Now, the good news is when you're a doctor and you call your own gynecologist and say, "I think I feel a mass," it's kind of like calling the gas company and saying you smell gas. They get you in right away. And my doctor examined me and said, "Well, the good news is you're not crazy." So in my case, the cyst was about 7 centimeters, which is very large, and did have to be removed. The good news, it was benign. But again, I didn't know that till after surgery. So Surbhi recognized that more than 300,000 American women have their ovaries removed each year because they either have suspicious masses or because they carry the BRCA gene that greatly increases their chances of developing ovarian cancer. Now, the bad news is we currently have no accurate screening test for ovarian cancer, like a pap smear is for cervical cancer or a mammogram is for breast cancer. We do have a blood test called the CA-125 that's used to help give us some information. But in my case, with an ovarian cyst, it was elevated the same way it would be with ovarian cancer. Therefore, because we don't have an accurate screening test, most women who are diagnosed with ovarian cancer are already in the later stages of the disease when their prognosis is poor. The nVision device we're going to hear about today aims to give doctors a way to screen for cancer earlier in these patients. Now, Surbhi Sarna is the daughter of Indian immigrants. Her mother, who has a PhD in Hindi literature, stayed home to raise her children. Her father, who's an engineer, worked at a series of startups. She clearly followed in Daddy's footsteps and founded nVision straight out of college from UC Berkeley in 2009, while she worked day jobs as an engineer in the medical device industry, first at Abbott Vascular and then later at early stage companies. Since then, she has authored numerous patents, been an invited speaker at universities including UCSF and Harvard, and has been featured in publications such as Bloomberg, Entrepreneur Magazine, and Giga Ohm. She was named on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for 2014, and she had a baby. So I'm guessing she's tired. Please help me welcome Surbhi Sarna into the ladies' room. Welcome. I hope I didn't put you to sleep with that lengthy introduction.
Oh my gosh, not at all. Danica, thank you so much for having me with you today. I always loved listening to you, and it's such a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you. And it's so great to have you. And when I saw your story, I was just like, yes, because we haven't talked about ovaries yet on this podcast. We've talked about every other female organ except the ovary. And as we know, in medicine, the ovaries are kind of sometimes overlooked. You had an introduction to your ovaries at 13. Did you know about them before that?
Yeah, I was aware that they existed, but not quite as aware as I became when I felt that sharp pain that you referenced earlier. And certainly some of my classmates that didn't know about the ovaries found out about them when, my medical condition was, discussed, or I was having pain, or I had to leave. So,
and did you have surgery, or was it just managed conservatively?
No, it was managed conservatively given my age at the time. And it was one of the lucky ones, and it was not cancerous, but it really put in my mind the need.
And did anybody in your family ever have ovarian cancer that you knew of?
Or no ovarian cancer, but breast cancer, right? Which is can be closely related. So
yeah, when I told my story of my ovarian cyst, and my son was in 4th grade at the time, and they had a homework assignment where they had to write a list of words beginning with the letter O, and then use each word in a sentence. And his words were ovary, ovarian cancer, ovariectomy, and obstetrician. And he used them all in a sentence. And the teacher, was on this, that this was weird from a 4th grade boy. And she sent home a note on his homework assignment saying, "Is everything okay at home?"
That's too funny. That's great. Good for him, though. Amazing.
Yeah. Now, had you already started having your periods when this happened?
I had, yeah. Mm-hmm. So this was, I think I got my period the year before. So 8th grade, got my period, and 9th grade was when the first cyst hit.
Mm-hmm. So there were subsequent cysts.
Yeah. I had one kind of on and off for the couple of years following until I found a birth control pill that really worked for me and prevented the recurrence.
Right. And that's very often the treatment recommendation is, I often say one of the worst things we ever did was call birth control pills, because we use them to treat many medical conditions. And one of the medical conditions we use them to treat are ovarian cysts. Do you remember how big your cyst ever got? What the biggest
7 centimeters, I think, is the same as yours. If I remember correctly. Yeah.
7 is usually when we operate. So I guess obviously because of your age, they decided not to do that when I had it at my age, I was in the age where we're much more suspicious of ovarian cancer. So it was a no-brainer. It was just, this has to come out. And I made the decision, since we're in the ladies' room and we share, because I think I was around, I guess, 40-ish, 40, maybe 39 for the first time. And so I made the decision to also have my tubes tied at the same time. Obviously we would never do that in a 13-year-old, but when at 40, that was kind of also a no-brainer.
Right. And which now it's well understood lessens the chance of ovarian cancer.
Oh, bless you. Bless you. And it's allergy season, which we're going to be talking about very shortly. Yeah, I know that most ovarian cancer actually originates in the fallopian tubes, which is a great intro to your device. So tell me the story. How did you think of this? How did you develop it? And where are you now in the development process?
Right. So absolutely. So, when I first had that incident, again, I had this, crazy dream at the time, is it possible to find an early detection mechanism for ovarian cancer? And because I was a patient, even when I was at Berkeley, kind of always kept my eye on the latest news around ovarian cancer. And then once I graduated, I went to go work for sort of corporate America to get that experience of being in a regulated industry. So I was at Abbott Vascular and then another device startup. And then around 2009, one of the first sort of seminal papers was published around this theory that most ovarian cancers, especially the most aggressive forms, actually start in the fallopian tube. And of course, before then, I sort of studied how we as a society have ever really positively impact, detection of cancer, or not even detection, but sort of reducing death from cancer. And it's always been because we've been able to get to the site of origin. So you think of a mammogram or a pap smear, it's always about being able to access that tissue and then hopefully that leading to early detection. And then reducing death caused by that particular cancer. So, of course, when I read the article that actually came out by the NCI in 2009,
and NCI, just sorry to interrupt, but for people who are listening, NCI is the National Cancer Institute.
Right. So the National Cancer Institute put this out in their newsletter in 2009. I thought, wow. Is there any way that we can truly access the tubes and get to the site of origin and collect cells while we were there? So then I went into the FDA database and I checked just to see had there been any other devices clear to access the full length of the tube for any other medical reason, outside of collecting cells from the tube. And what I found was though other companies had tried to get to the distal end of the tube, the FDA never thought that data was safe enough to give them sort of the full-length access indication. And so then I started going to literature to understand why. And the reason is the fallopian tube is an especially tricky anatomy. It's very narrow, it's very tortuous, has very thin walls, and it doesn't offer a lot of tactile feedback to the user. So what that means is imagine the consistency of a wet paper towel. So you could be poking at it, and it really wouldn't give you any feedback back until you've actually torn through it. So the next trick was, the first trick I should say is, how do you successfully navigate an anatomy like that? And then the second was, how do you collect cells? Mm-hmm. And so it was from that we thought of the idea of actually going into the fallopian tube with a balloon that self-navigates and then also collects cells on its surface.
That's incredible. And how do you get the balloon there?
So we get the catheter to the ostium using a device called a hysteroscope. Mm-hmm. A hysteroscope is a rigid endoscope that's used by the gynecologist traditionally to assess the health of the lining of the uterus during infertility workup. And so basically what it is, it's a camera, and it allows you to look at the uterus, and some of these cameras have another channel where you can then put a device through that channel. So you first use what they call the hysteroscope to look at the uterus and find the openings of the fallopian tube, and then you place another device through the hysteroscope to access the fallopian tube. So that's how you get the balloon there.
Wow. Very impressive. And where are you in development now? Obviously, you need lots of research. So you've done your test of concept.
Right. We actually have FDA clearance after 80 patients worth of data. So
congratulations.
Thank you. And what we demonstrated in that study is that we're able to access the full length of the fallopian tube safely, and then we're able to get a cell sample that is adequate. And we are currently doing additional clinical trials to demonstrate how often when there is cancer in the fallopian tube, we're able to correctly identify that cancer.
Okay, so what is your control group? Is your control group women who are having surgery anyway?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're going into patient populations that are going to have surgery anyway. And like you said, only a small percentage of the time they will actually have cancer. But once they have their surgery, we're able to compare the cell sample that we got directly with the tissue and there demonstrate that, how many times we had the same result as the actual tissue or how many times we differed.
And are you just studying women who have questionable ovarian cysts, or are you also doing a study in women with BRCA2 abnormalities who are prophylactically having their fallopian tubes removed?
We're still kind of going through that process, but certainly women going through thinking through that, but certainly women that we know that we will be including women that are having surgery because of some sort of suspicious mass.
Great. And do you have criteria for whether their their CA-125 blood test is elevated, or you're just taking all comers?
All comers, just any case where the physician thought it was serious enough to do surgery.
Got it. And as I said in the opening, you have 300,000 women a year to choose from then.
Right.
This is such a common situation. It's interesting. You made a comment earlier that whenever we have a screening test for cancer, it gets at the site of origin. And it occurred to me that when you said that, my brain kind of went to thinking, okay, what else do all of these screening tests have in common for different cancers? And they're all devices.
Right.
It's interesting that so far the attempts to use blood tests as screening tests for cancer have not yet panned out completely. I mean, we still, of course, in men, we rely on the PSA as a initial screen, but it's very controversial about how accurate that is as a screening test, and so many things can make it abnormally elevated, including recently having had sex. In women, we tried the CA-125, and again, so many things can make it falsely elevated. I can't think of any other way that we diagnose cancer other through a device or obviously surgery.
Right, or colonoscopy, for example.
Yeah, that's a device.
Yeah, it's all device-based. And so, I started this company, I'm working on this product because I was a patient. And so, I would love to be put out of a job by an accurate blood test. I would love it. But so far, we've spent a couple of decades and, tens of billions of dollars kind of looking for this holy grail blood test. Mm-hmm. And we just haven't found it. And in the meantime, devices have really been what's the stopgap between, what these blood tests can't find. And like you said, often it's because blood tests are elevated for a variety of reasons, right? They're non-specific. Right,
we're using markers, which are surrogates for the cancer.
Right.
When you're capturing cells, when I want to make clear to everybody, when you're capturing cells, you're getting actual pathology. So I guess also we kind of have a screening test for lung cancer. You could say, well, we use a sputum sample in lung cancer, but really the initial test is usually an X-ray. So we're back to devices.
Right, and the definitive for lung cancer is a biopsy, right?
Yeah. Well, the definitive test for any cancer is biopsy. Right. Are you trying to make the argument that your test will be a definitive test, or that you would still need tissue sample?
I think that if our test is the definitive test, is the call of malignant, right? Because if you have a cluster,
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
I think that our test would be the definitive test if you obtain cancerous clusters. I mean, you would still go in.
And then you would do surgery.
Right, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But you could definitively say whether or not there's malignant cells present, right?
Right. So it would be definitive if it was positive.
Right.
If it was negative, we could say, well, we just didn't capture any cancerous cells.
Continue to survey.
Right. Come back in a year. Or there's actually something similar that Dr. Susan Love has been working on for many years for breast cancer, ductal lavage. Did you look at her work and sort of compare notes?
Yeah, no, certainly I did. And ductal lavage is such an interesting example because, whenever you are the biopsy tool or the lavage tool, you aren't the one that's actually making the call on cancer. It's the pathologist on the back end that's looking at the sample. And what you do on the pathology end can have a lot of variation, depending on the test that you run on the cell sample itself. You may get more or less accurate answers, right? And so I really studied the parallel and kind of their conversation with the FDA and what kind of clinical studies that they've done to kind of model after.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And it's really incredible how all of these learnings, really build on each other and really help each other. But it really just takes an incredible spark of ingenuity and idea. And then, of course, 10%, the saying about innovation is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. And
right.
It sounds like you've really put in the perspiration hours. Now, I understand that you also have another device in development with nVision.
We did.
That's not on the table anymore?
Right. Well, I mean, right now we're kind of sitting down and looking through the whole portfolio to decide what we'll be moving forward with. But we did have a couple of other devices. I always thought of nVision as being sort of the fallopian tube company. So there's other opportunity, within the fallopian tube around, detection of blockages for infertility workup and or delivery of therapy directly to the peritoneal cavity into the fallopian tubes. Using a working channel through our device. And so currently we're kind of scoping out, if and when we'll be spending resources on additional devices.
Okay. My understanding is, though, that the deal you have with Boston Scientific is an acquisition of the company, not just of this particular product.
The whole thing, yeah.
Right. So, that will be you'll have a much bigger set of resources at your disposal.
Absolutely.
Now.
Absolutely.
Evaluating your portfolio. So what's next for you?
Yeah. I mean, I love the women's health space. I'd love to continue innovating. In medical devices specifically, I think there's so much promise, in this field, and some of it's been realized, some of it hasn't. And, I love that early stage process where you have sort of a concept and a dream, exactly what type of clinical need you are trying to solve for. You put together a clinical team, a killer team to kind of help you get through all of those hurdles. So on one hand, I can see sort of the attractiveness of starting another company. Certainly we'll stay with Boston Scientific and make sure that this product is, carried forward and help out in any way that I can there. And I'm also very interested in nonprofit work. So acquisition was just about a month ago. So just trying to sort of assess what, potential next steps are out there for me.
And personally, you have a relatively new baby.
Right. Absolutely. And so his name is Shreyas. He's 17 months old right now. He's, of course, the light of my life. And, every day is just a new day for him. Took him to San Diego this weekend. He did a lot of swimming.
Oh, great.
That was fun, So with the little guy at home and with having a demanding job, work-life balance is always sort of top of mind. how to figure out how to be everywhere at the same time. So I'm really looking forward to the next few months and figuring out, what next steps are and what balance means and getting reacquainted with the gym.
Well, if you figure out what balance means, please, by all means, come back and share that with us. I can tell you now that my kids are fully grown and have launched into careers of their own. I think I figured out retrospectively a couple of things. First is you can certainly have it all, be it all, do it all, just not at the same time. Second of all, you have to sleep. And you have to sleep at some point. And I know when I was at your stage of the game, I did not practice what I preach. Specifically being a resident in OBGYN, I never slept. But we did have a guest, the sleep doctor, a few weeks ago who talked about all things sleep related. So if you need that, listen to that episode. And I
will definitely go back to that. Yeah.
The third thing that I think I figured out is there's no such thing as figuring out work-life balance because it changes not only year to year and month to month and week to week and not only day to day, but even within a day, it can just change on a dime. So I think being flexible, being resilient, and being able to just kind of roll with the punches. And then the best advice I ever got was from the late Bernadine Healy, who was the first woman to ever be the director, actually first and only woman to be the director of the National Institutes of Health. She was a brilliant, brilliant cardiologist. And I went to hear her give a lecture when I was a medical student. And she said, hire the best household help you can, whether or not you have children. And I always used that advice as a great excuse to outsource anything that I didn't want to do or couldn't do. So that's all I can tell you about it. Everything else is just kind of, everything else comes down to my number one piece of mommy advice, which is it all depends on everything.
Yeah. I completely agree with every single thing you brought up. I the concept of having it all is such a hotly debated thing for women. And for me, I think that you can have it all as long as you carefully define what having it all means.
And I think it's more to focus on having enough.
Yeah.
And what is enough for you at that time? And again, that can always change. We can always rewrite that. But anyway, I think all of these things are just really important. I think what's so great about what you did is you took something that was extremely intimate and personal to your experience. And you said, okay, this was a problem for me. Clearly, this is a problem for millions of other women. Now, how do I take that as motivation and as germination for the idea? And how do we solve that problem? So were there any other light bulbs that went off for you when you were pregnant and when you delivered?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I feel like I have a laundry list of, women's health related issues that I would like to, one day tackle. And I think specifically around pregnancy and childbirth, there is, although there's so many different needs, there are real reasons why innovation hasn't happened in that space. I mean, imagine, trying to do a clinical trial with, pregnant women or, trying something new and novel at childbirth. So I think, and of course, traditionally, most innovators are men, right? So, first of all,
most innovators are women, but the men who are their collaborators or coworkers get credit for it.
Right, exactly. And they also dictate where the funding goes. So, so I think it's time for a new approach, and kind of long realized problems will start, I think now that there are, still not a lot of women who are in venture capital, but a lot more than there was. And there is sort of a recognition, nVision as an example, did very, very well for investors. So even if women's health didn't seem like a sexy space to investors beforehand, I think there might be some examples coming up where, you can kind of do good and do well at the same time. So yeah, just I mean, it's a lot. There's a lot to be done.
Yeah, I remember 100 years ago when I was a medical director at a multinational pharmaceutical company. I wanted to start a women's health department within the company. And our company was not a maker of birth control pills or hormone replacement therapy or anything at that time for breast cancer. And so the idea was, well, what would we be doing in women's health? And I said, well, we're in cardiovascular disease, we're in psychiatry, we're in endocrinology, we're in bone disease, we're in cancer, we're in transplantation. All of these things are women's health issue, headache, depression. So I got the courage to ask for a very small budget from our then CEO. And he was a man of very few words. And he looked at me after my presentation and he said, he pointed his big finger at me and he said, Dr. Moore, how do you justify such a large budget, which was minimal, for a niche population?
Yeah.
And I said, with all due respect, I fail to see how 52% of the population is a niche.
Right.
And then I really got bold and said, and with all due respect, if we had 52% of the marketplace in any disease area that we're in, we would be very happy with that.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So did this company ever venture into women's health at any point?
They did. And the budget was approved. After I said those two things, he just said approved, and then he said next. But yeah, I think what needed to happen at that time, and this was 1989, what happened at that time throughout medicine was there was a paradigm shift, where we started looking at women as the majority of the population, and we started looking at our changing demographics and aging of America, and we started saying, what's good for women's health is actually good for health of everybody. And this is not just about painting the waiting room pink. We need real solutions for really specific problems that are different in women and men. And the most extreme examples of what's different in women and men are diseases like ovarian cancer.
Right.
Men don't get it.
Right.
Somebody once I wrote an article about something about ovarian cancer years ago. And somebody sent me a very nasty email. I assume it was a male by the tone of it. And it was like, why are you always talking about ovarian cancer in women? Why aren't you ever talking about ovarian cancer in men?
Oh, God. Yes, I dare say that was a man.
So, yeah, and hopefully he was drunk.
Yeah, seriously.
But although now, yes, there are transgender men who have ovaries. So
Right.
That's true. Although most transgender men, of course, have their ovaries removed.
Right.
So that's a whole nother story. And
Right.
We will get to that eventually on this podcast. But other men do not have ovaries.
Right. Right.
Anyway, so tell me, what was the most unusual experience, unusual, different, interesting, or memorable experience you ever had in a ladies' room other than this interview?
Oh, wow. Okay. That's an interesting question. In the ladies' room, huh? Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had a few funny stories. I mean, lots happen at the ladies' rooms, ladies' rooms. But it's so funny because until you asked me that question, I didn't really quite realize how many different stories. I'm trying to think through which one was most funny or memorable or just distinct. I mean, I certainly remember I've comforted strangers who've just gone through a breakup in the bathroom of a restaurant, in the ladies' room. I have coached a very nervous woman about a interview she was about to have in the restroom of a larger company. So the full range, right? It's an interesting space. Women feel comfortable.
And that's why we call this podcast In the Ladies' Room. And that's why I always ask that question. It's kind of to remind us that the ladies' room is the place where, as women, we really connect as total strangers. And sometimes we're more comfortable sharing our most intimate fears or anxieties, whether it's about a breakup or an interview, or we've heard stories about women comforting each other in the bathroom over period problems and medical problems, et cetera. But it's where we really connect and where we as women are kind of, all there for each other. And that's kind of what we're going for with this podcast.
Well, perfect. You do a great job with it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us. We actually talked to Rachel Braun-Scherl last week, who, of course, is the author of Orgasmic Leadership, and talking about a term that she didn't coin, but was coined about her. And now I'm going to pass it back to you. The term is a vagipreneur. And these are entrepreneurs in women's health. It started because she was focusing on vaginal health, but now we're expanding it to women's health entrepreneurs throughout the reproductive tract. So you've just now been officially knighted as a vagipreneur.
That's great. That's great.
So in your spare time, you can read her book, which is just out. But what's your advice to other women who want to be vagipreneurs or women's health entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I mean, just be resilient. I think that's the most important part of it. Stick with your guns, and don't necessarily use anyone but physicians to sort of validate whether or not your concept is needed. Don't go out to the folks who you're trying to fundraise from and let them tell you that the need isn't big enough or that there isn't a need. Work very closely with physicians very early on to define exactly what the need is and for exactly what populations, and then just don't take no for an answer. Just stick with it.
I think physicians have to validate your concept, but also women who are, potential users have to not only validate your concept, but validate the need and also validate that they would be willing to pay for whatever X product is. Obviously, you're in a different situation because ultimately when your product is approved and marketed and used, you'll have that whole insurance dynamic going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm sure you've already done some homework in that arena about reimbursement.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I would think that if the concept is validated and if your research pans out, insurance companies are going to be beating down your doors because obviously not only would this save lives and save, morbidity, and horrible treatment regimens with chemo and radiation, et cetera, it will save a lot of money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think that's one of the things too in that arena of doing well, doing well by doing good.
Right.
Has always been kind of my mantra in business as a physician, is that in general, most of the really great innovations not only save lives, but also save money. So I often feel like if I can't get their attention talking about the medical benefits of something, I can usually get their attention talking about the financial benefits.
Right. No, absolutely. I completely agree with that.
And that's a harsh reality. And then the other harsh reality too is this issue of, you're talking about most of the people who you have to raise money from are men.
Right.
And sometimes you have to get to the point of where they can relate to the situation personally. So absolutely. I think you've probably had the experience where if somebody's mother had this or sister had this or wife had this,
right,
then it's a totally different discussion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think everything in business or maybe even in life is about that human connection. And so, when folks have experienced something personally, or if they know a friend that has either gone through ovarian cancer or is high risk for it, it kind of brings the situation to a whole new sort of light and a whole new light for them. So absolutely.
Well, I wish you every success. If there's any way I can be of any help to you, don't hesitate to contact me. And please come back and tell us how this is going in, say, a year or 9 months gestation time.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for having me today. This was a lot of fun, and I certainly look forward to staying in touch.
Great. Take care. Thanks again.
All right. You too. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. That's all we have time for today. But let's keep the conversation going on Twitter or Facebook at Dr. Donica. And please join us next week for another episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Real conversations with real women about really intimate topics.